Colonel Margaret Maggie Chen stepped off the military transport at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, wearing simple civilian clothes, a modest gray sweater and dark slacks that did nothing to announce her rank or position. At 52, her graying hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her face bore the quiet weathering of someone who had spent decades in service without seeking recognition. She had chosen to arrive this way deliberately. The inspection she was conducting required her to see the base as it truly operated, not as it performed for visiting brass. Too many problems were hidden behind fresh paint and rehearsed procedures when senior officers announced their arrivals. Her aide, Captain Jessica Park, walked beside her with a small bag containing their credentials and the document that would change everything, the command seal of the Inspector General's office, authorizing Colonel Chen to investigate allegations of misconduct at the highest levels of the base's leadership. "Ma'am, are you sure about this approach?" Captain Park asked quietly. "Without your uniform, people might not." "That's exactly the point, Captain," Maggie replied. "I want to see how they treat ordinary people. That tells me more than any briefing ever could." They made their way toward the base headquarters building, passing groups of soldiers going about their daily routines. No one paid attention to the two women in civilian clothes, which was precisely what Maggie wanted. As they approached the headquarters entrance, a formation of soldiers was assembling in the adjacent parade ground. A young lieutenant was conducting what appeared to be a disciplinary formation, his voice carrying across the area as he berated a private for some infraction. "This is exactly the kind of sloppy performance that makes this unit a disgrace," the lieutenant shouted, his face red with anger. "When I give an order, I expect immediate compliance, not excuses." Maggie paused to observe, her experienced eye taking in the dynamics of the situation. The private being disciplined was a young woman, barely out of basic training by the look of her. She stood at rigid attention while the lieutenant circled her like a predator. "Private Torres, you think the rules don't apply to you because you're a woman?" the lieutenant continued. "Is that it? You think you can just coast by on special treatment?" Something cold settled in Maggie's chest. She had heard this tone before, countless times throughout her 30-year career. It was the sound of someone who had learned to hide their prejudice behind the mask of discipline. "Sir, I was only trying to," the private began. "Did I give you permission to speak?" The lieutenant's voice rose even louder. "You stand there and take it like the soldier you claim to be." Captain Park touched Maggie's arm gently. "Ma'am, we should proceed to the commander's office. We have an appointment." Maggie nodded but didn't move. Something about this situation demanded her attention. The lieutenant noticed the two women watching from the edge of the parade ground. His expression shifted from anger to irritation at the interruption. "Can I help you?" he called out, his tone making it clear that help was the last thing he intended to offer. "This is a restricted area. Civilians need to check in at the visitor center." Maggie walked toward him, her stride unhurried but purposeful. "I was just observing, Lieutenant." "Lieutenant Marcus Webb," he supplied with barely concealed contempt. "And you are?" "Just a visitor," Maggie replied mildly. Webb looked her up and down, taking in her civilian clothes and her age. Whatever he saw clearly didn't impress him. "Well, just a visitor, this isn't a spectator sport. The parade ground is for military personnel only." He turned back to his formation. "Now if you'll excuse me, I'm conducting important training." "What was Private Torres's infraction?" Maggie asked, not moving. Webb spun back around, his face reddening. "That's none of your business, ma'am. I don't know who you are or why you think you can question military procedures, but I suggest you move along before I have you escorted off this base." Several soldiers in the formation were watching the exchange now, their expressions a mixture of discomfort and curiosity. Private Torres remained at rigid attention, but her eyes flickered briefly toward Maggie with something that might have been hope. "I'm asking," Maggie said calmly, "because public humiliation is rarely an effective disciplinary tool. Particularly when the criticism appears to be based on gender rather than actual performance issues." Webb's face went from red to purple. He stepped toward Maggie, using his height to intimidate her. "Listen here, lady," he said, his voice dropping to a threatening growl. "I don't know what kind of bleeding heart civilian nonsense you're peddling, but the military has its own way of doing things. We don't need some middle-aged nobody telling us how to train our soldiers." Captain Park stepped forward. "Lieutenant, I think you should stay out of this," Webb snapped at her. "I'll deal with you in a minute." He turned back to Maggie. "As for you, I'm done being polite." Security. Two MPs who had been standing near the headquarters building began walking toward them. Maggie remained perfectly still, her expression unchanged. "Lieutenant Webb, I'm going to give you one opportunity to reconsider your behavior." "Or what?" Webb laughed derisively. "You'll report me to someone?" "Go ahead. I'd love to see you try to explain to the base commander why you were interfering with military training." "I don't need to explain anything to the base commander," Maggie replied quietly. "But you will." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a small leather case. Opening it, she revealed a medallion bearing the seal of the Department of Defense Inspector General's office, along with a laminated card identifying her as Colonel Margaret Chen, Senior Inspector. The command seal glinted in the morning sunlight. It was one of the most powerful credentials in the military, authorization to investigate, question, and recommend action against any personnel regardless of rank or position. Webb's face went white. The swagger drained out of his body like water from a broken vessel. "Colonel. I didn't, there must be some mistake." "There's no mistake, Lieutenant," Maggie said, her voice still calm but now carrying unmistakable authority. "What there is, however, is a problem. And I believe I'm looking at it." The MPs had arrived but stopped short when they saw the command seal. They immediately came to attention, recognizing the significance of what they were witnessing. "Captain Park," Maggie continued, "please note the date, time, and location of this incident for our report. Also note that Lieutenant Webb publicly humiliated a subordinate using gender-based criticism, threatened a senior officer, and attempted to have that officer removed from the base." "Yes, ma'am," Captain Park replied, already writing in her notebook. Webb looked like he might be sick. "Colonel, please, I had no way of knowing who you were." "If I had known." "That's precisely the problem, Lieutenant," Maggie interrupted. "Your behavior shouldn't change based on who's watching. The way you treat people when you think no one important is observing, that's who you really are." She looked at the formation of soldiers, all of whom were now watching with wide eyes. "Formation dismissed," she said calmly. "Private Torres, please remain. I'd like to speak with you." As the soldiers dispersed, many of them casting sympathetic glances at the shell-shocked lieutenant, Maggie walked toward the young private who had been the target of Webb's tirade. The private saluted crisply. "Colonel, I want to thank you for—" "Don't thank me yet, Private," Maggie said gently. "We have a lot to discuss. And I have a feeling that Lieutenant Webb's behavior today is just the tip of a much larger iceberg." Private Elena Torres sat across from Colonel Chen in a small conference room that had been hastily cleared for the Inspector General's use. The young soldier's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her expression a mixture of relief and anxiety. "Private Torres," Maggie began gently, "I want you to understand that nothing you tell me will result in retaliation against you. The Inspector General's office has the authority to protect witnesses, and I will use that authority." "Yes, ma'am," Torres replied, though her body language suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Maggie understood the young woman's hesitation. Throughout her career, she had seen too many soldiers silenced by fear of retribution, their complaints buried under layers of institutional protection for those in power. "Let's start with this morning. What was Lieutenant Webb actually disciplining you for?" Torres swallowed hard. "I was 2 minutes late to formation, ma'am. My alarm malfunctioned, and I—" 2 minutes, Maggie repeated. "And the response was public humiliation in front of your entire unit?" "Lieutenant Webb says that small failures lead to big failures, ma'am. He says discipline must be absolute." Is that what he says? Maggie's voice remained calm, but her eyes sharpened. And does he apply this philosophy equally to all soldiers, or does it seem particularly focused on certain individuals? Torres hesitated, and in that hesitation, Maggie saw the truth that the private was afraid to speak aloud. I notice there are several women in your unit, Maggie continued. Have any of them experienced similar treatment? Ma'am, I don't want to get anyone in trouble. Lieutenant Webb has connections. His uncle is Colonel David Webb, the base commander, Maggie finished. Yes, I'm aware of the relationship. That's actually one of the reasons I'm here. Torres looked up in surprise. You knew about that? Private, the Inspector General's office received several anonymous complaints over the past 6 months. All of them alleged a pattern of harassment and discrimination at Fort Campbell, and all of them suggested that the base commander was protecting certain officers from accountability. Maggie leaned forward slightly. Those complaints were dismissed at the local level without investigation. My job is to find out why, and to determine whether the allegations have merit. For the first time, Torres's guarded expression began to soften. Ma'am, it's not just Lieutenant Webb. It's the whole culture here. The women in our unit, we've learned to keep our heads down and not complain. When someone does complain, things get worse for them, not better. Tell me more, Maggie said. Over the next hour, Torres described a pattern of behavior that made Maggie's blood boil despite her decades of professional composure. Female soldiers were routinely given the worst assignments, passed over for promotions, and subjected to discipline that their male counterparts never faced for similar infractions. When complaints were filed, they disappeared into a bureaucratic void. The few women who persisted found themselves transferred to undesirable positions or pushed out of the service entirely. There's one more thing, ma'am, Torres said, her voice dropping. Specialist Amy Richardson. She filed a formal complaint against Lieutenant Webb 3 months ago. 2 weeks later, she was reassigned to Alaska. Nobody's heard from her since. Maggie exchanged a glance with Captain Park, who had been taking detailed notes throughout the interview. Do you know the nature of Specialist Richardson's complaint? Maggie asked. Torres shook her head. She didn't tell anyone the specifics. But I saw her crying in the barracks the night before she filed it. Whatever happened, it was bad. After Torres was dismissed with assurances of protection, Maggie sat in silence for a long moment. The pattern she was seeing was depressingly familiar, a toxic leadership culture protected by family connections and institutional inertia. Ma'am, Captain Park said carefully, Colonel Webb is expecting us in his office in 30 minutes. He's been the base commander for 3 years, and he has a lot of allies in the Pentagon. I'm aware of his connections, Captain, Maggie replied. I'm also aware that his nephew just threatened a colonel in front of witnesses. That gives us significant leverage. She stood, straightening her civilian clothes. But before we meet with Colonel Webb, I want to see the personnel files for every woman who's been transferred out of this base in the past 2 years. And I want to locate Specialist Amy Richardson. That might take some time, ma'am. Then we'd better get started. In the meantime, please inform Colonel Webb that our meeting will need to be postponed. I have additional interviews to conduct. The message would send a clear signal. The Inspector General's office operated on its own timeline, not the base commander's. And Colonel Margaret Chen had not traveled to Fort Campbell to be managed or manipulated. As they left the conference room, Maggie's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Colonel Chen, some of us have been waiting for someone like you. We have information. Meet us at the chapel at 1900. Maggie showed the message to Captain Park. It seems we've attracted some attention. Could be a trap, ma'am, Park cautioned. Colonel Webb's allies might be trying to discredit you. Perhaps, Maggie acknowledged. But it could also be exactly what we need, witnesses willing to come forward now that they know someone is finally listening. She looked out the window at the parade ground where Lieutenant Webb had humiliated Private Torres just hours earlier. The young lieutenant was nowhere to be seen, probably receiving instructions from his uncle on how to handle the situation. "We'll attend the meeting at the chapel," Maggie decided. "But we'll take precautions. Whatever is happening at this base, I intend to expose it fully. No one is above accountability, not Lieutenant Webb, not Colonel Webb, and not anyone who has enabled their behavior." Captain Park nodded. "Understood, ma'am. I'll make the arrangements." As her aide departed, Maggie allowed herself a moment of reflection. She had spent 30 years in the military, climbing through ranks that had never been designed to accommodate women like her. Every promotion had been harder than it should have been, every achievement scrutinized more carefully than those of her male peers. She had persevered not for herself, but for the women who would come after her. Now, in her final years of service, she had the power to make a real difference. And she intended to use it. The base chapel was empty when Maggie arrived at 1900, its wooden pews casting long shadows in the fading evening light. Captain Park had positioned herself outside, ready to summon help if needed, but Maggie had insisted on entering alone. Witnesses were more likely to speak freely without an audience. She took a seat in the front pew and waited. 5 minutes later, the chapel door opened, and 3 women in army uniforms slipped inside. They were of varying ranks, a staff sergeant, a specialist, and a private first class, but they shared the same nervous, determined expressions. "Colonel Chen," the staff sergeant asked, approaching cautiously. "That's right. And you are?" "Staff Sergeant Maria Hernandez, ma'am." She gestured to her companions. "This is Specialist Diana Kowalski and Private First Class Jennifer Adams. We weren't sure you'd come." "You reached out because you have information," Maggie said. "I'm here to listen." The 3 women exchanged glances, silently debating who would speak first. Finally, Staff Sergeant Hernandez took a deep breath. "Ma'am, what happened this morning with Lieutenant Webb, that wasn't unusual. That's just how things are here for women. But there's more. Things that we couldn't report through normal channels because the normal channels are part of the problem." "Tell me everything," Maggie said. For the next 2 hours, the 3 soldiers painted a picture of systematic abuse that went far beyond Lieutenant Webb's public harassment. They described a base where female soldiers were routinely subjected to hostile treatment, where complaints were ignored or actively suppressed, and where those who persisted in seeking justice were punished. But the most disturbing information concerned Colonel David Webb himself. "He hosts these mentoring dinners for junior officers," Specialist Kowalski explained, her voice tight with anger. "Female officers only. He says it's to help us advance our careers, but everyone knows what really happens." "And what does happen?" Maggie asked carefully. "Some of the women who attend, they get promoted fast. Others who refuse the invitations, they don't get promoted at all." Kowalski's hands were shaking. "I was invited 6 months ago. I said no. Since then, I've been passed over for 3 positions I was qualified for." Private First Class Adams spoke up for the first time. "Specialist Richardson, the one who was transferred to Alaska, she attended one of those dinners. Whatever happened that night, she was never the same afterward. When she filed her complaint, it was about Colonel Webb, not Lieutenant Webb." Maggie felt cold fury building in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. "Do you have any documentation? Written records, witnesses, anything that could corroborate these allegations?" Staff Sergeant Hernandez reached into her uniform pocket and pulled out a flash drive. "We've been collecting evidence for months, ma'am. Emails, performance evaluations that don't match the actual work records, transfer orders that don't make sense. It's all here." She handed the flash drive to Maggie. "We didn't know what to do with it. We were afraid that if we went to anyone on base, it would just disappear like everything else. But when we heard you were here, when we saw what happened this morning." "You saw an opportunity," Maggie finished. "We saw hope, ma'am," Hernandez corrected quietly. "For the first time in a long time." Maggie looked at the 3 women, seeing in their faces the same determination she had felt countless times in her own career. They had taken an enormous risk by coming forward, and they deserved to know that their courage would not be wasted. "I want you to understand what happens now," she said. "This investigation is going to expand significantly. There will be formal interviews, depositions, and potentially courts-martial. Your lives are going to become very complicated for a while." The three soldiers nodded, their expressions resolute. "But I also want you to know this," Maggie continued. "What you're doing takes more courage than anything I've ever seen on a battlefield. You're fighting for every woman who's been silenced, every career that's been derailed, every soldier who's been told that this is just how things are." She stood, tucking the flash drive into her pocket. "It's not how things have to be. And after today, it won't be how things are here anymore." As Maggie left the chapel, she found Captain Park waiting with news. "Ma'am, Colonel Webb has been calling the Inspector General's office in Washington. He's trying to go over your head, claiming you've overstepped your authority." And what was Washington's response? Park allowed herself a small smile. "They told him that you have full authority to conduct this investigation however you see fit, and that any attempt to obstruct you would be considered a federal offense." "Good," Maggie said. "Then let's give Colonel Webb something to really worry about. I want a full forensic analysis of that flash drive, and I want to locate Specialist Amy Richardson immediately. Whatever happened to her, she deserves to have her story heard." The battle lines were drawn. On one side stood a powerful base commander with family connections and decades of accumulated influence. On the other stood a colonel in civilian clothes with a command seal and the determination to see justice done. For Maggie, the choice of which side to fight for had been made long ago, in the days when she herself had been a young female officer facing barriers that seemed insurmountable. She had promised herself then that if she ever gained power, she would use it to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. That promise had never felt more important than it did tonight. The next morning, Colonel David Webb sat behind his massive desk, his expression a careful mask of professional concern that didn't quite hide the anger burning in his eyes. He was a large man in his late 50s, with the bearing of someone who had spent his career expecting deference and usually receiving it. Maggie sat across from him, still in civilian clothes, the command seal visible on the table between them. "Colonel Chen," Webb began, his voice smooth and controlled, "I want to apologize for my nephew's behavior yesterday. He's young, passionate about discipline, and sometimes that passion gets the better of him." "Lieutenant Webb threatened a senior officer and attempted to have her removed from the base," Maggie replied. "That's more than youthful passion, Colonel. That's a serious breach of military conduct." Of course. He'll be appropriately counseled. He'll be formally reprimanded and reassigned pending investigation," Maggie corrected. "But that's actually the least of your concerns right now." Webb's mask slipped slightly. "I'm not sure what you mean." Maggie opened the folder she had brought with her. "I've spent the last 18 hours reviewing personnel records, conducting interviews, and analyzing evidence provided by members of your command. The picture that's emerging is deeply troubling." She laid out several documents on the desk. "These are transfer orders for female soldiers who filed complaints about workplace conditions. In every case, the transfer was processed within 2 weeks of the complaint, and the soldier was sent to an undesirable posting." Webb glanced at the documents without picking them up. "Transfer decisions are based on the needs of the service. If some of those soldiers happen to be reassigned after filing complaints, that's coincidental." "Perhaps," Maggie acknowledged. "But this pattern extends over 3 years and affects more than 24 women. That's a very long coincidence." She laid out more documents. "These are performance evaluations for female soldiers who declined invitations to your mentoring dinners. Their ratings dropped significantly after they refused, despite no change in their actual job performance." Webb's expression hardened. "Those dinners are a legitimate professional development opportunity. If some soldiers chose not to participate, that might indicate a lack of commitment to their careers. Or it might indicate discomfort with the nature of the opportunities being offered, Maggie replied quietly. The room fell silent. Webb's mask had completely fallen away now, replaced by barely concealed hostility. Colonel Chen, I don't know what kind of witch hunt you think you're conducting here, but I've served this country for 32 years. I have commendations from 3 different presidents. My record is impeccable. Your record is being re-evaluated as we speak, Maggie said. I've requested a comprehensive review of every personnel action you've approved during your time as base commander. Webb stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is outrageous. You come here in civilian clothes, with no advance notice, and start making accusations based on the complaints of malcontents and underperformers. I came here in civilian clothes specifically to see how this base operates when you think no one important is watching, Maggie replied, remaining seated. What I saw confirmed every complaint that's been filed. Those complaints were investigated and dismissed. They were dismissed by officers who report to you, Maggie countered. That's not investigation, that's cover-up. Webb leaned forward, placing his hands on the desk. Colonel, I'm going to be very direct with you. I have friends in high places. Very high places. One phone call, and this investigation disappears. Your career along with it. Maggie met his gaze without flinching. Colonel Webb, I've been threatened by men with more power and fewer scruples than you. I'm still here, and most of them aren't. She stood, gathering her documents. Here's what's going to happen. The Criminal Investigation Division is already on their way from Washington. They'll be conducting a parallel investigation into allegations of sexual harassment and abuse of power. You'll be placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. You can't do that, Webb sputtered. I already have. Maggie held up her phone, showing him the message she had received moments before entering his office. The order was signed by the Secretary of the Army 30 minutes ago. Your access to this base will be suspended within the hour. Webb's face went from red to white. This is a mistake. When my friends hear about this. Your friends are the ones who signed the order, Maggie interrupted. When faced with a choice between protecting you and protecting the integrity of the military, they chose the military. That's how it's supposed to work. There was a knock at the door, and 2 military police officers entered. Colonel Webb, one of them said formally, we're here to escort you from the premises. Please surrender your credentials and any base access materials. As Webb was led out of his own office, he turned to look at Maggie one final time. You haven't won anything. This will all blow over, and I'll be back. Perhaps, Maggie acknowledged. But even if you are, things will be different here. The women you silenced are speaking now, and their voices will be heard. After Webb was gone, Captain Park entered the office. Ma'am, we've located Specialist Richardson. She's willing to give a statement. Excellent. What about Lieutenant Webb? Confined to quarters pending the investigation. He's been calling his uncle every 10 minutes, but Colonel Webb is no longer in a position to help him. Maggie nodded, feeling the weight of the past 2 days beginning to lift. The battle wasn't over. Investigations of this magnitude took months or years to complete, and powerful people would undoubtedly try to interfere. But the first victory had been won. The wall of silence had been broken, and the truth was finally beginning to emerge. 3 weeks later, Colonel Margaret Chen sat in a formal hearing room at the Pentagon, watching as one witness after another testified about conditions at Fort Campbell. The investigation had expanded far beyond what anyone had initially anticipated, revealing a web of misconduct that extended through multiple commands and decades of service. Specialist Amy Richardson took the stand, her voice steady despite the obvious difficulty of what she was describing. Colonel Webb invited me to one of his mentoring dinners, she said. I thought it was a genuine opportunity. I was wrong.